because I get to talk every day to folks like the people in this room. I get to talk to sales leaders, really, really smart ones. And one of the things that happens, as you may have noticed in the conversation so far, is that most of the time these conversations turn to what a crazy moment this is in sales, this inflection point that we're in, where it feels like AI is everywhere. AI makes everything possible, including things that seemed previously impossible, like suddenly our reps being 10x more capable than they were previously. That's the first part of the conversation. The second part of the conversation usually trends towards how much of this is just a bunch of bullshit? How much of this is just hype, right? How is any of this actually possible? And I think that's the real challenge here, because it's so easy to say anything's possible with AI. But what I want to do today is dive deeper into that and actually try to reverse engineer. What would it mean to have a 10x sales rep? What has to be true for that to be the case? And so I think I come by this kind of naturally. So for me, if you look at the last 15 years of my career, I've been a startup founder twice now. I've been part of $3 billion in M&A. I've run a 50-person RevOps team supporting 600 sellers for a publicly traded company. And all those things were super focused on revenue, go-to-market, rep performance, right? But if you go back a little farther, this was me. I used to be a developer. So this was only taken slightly before that headshot. I don't know if you noticed that. So I used to be a developer. I have continued to be a software engineer off and on in my career, but I wanted to be a great developer. I still sometimes want to be a great developer, and I really wanted to build great things. And so when Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, who many of you have probably heard of, published an essay about 20 years ago called Great Hackers, it really spoke to me. And the idea behind the essay was fundamentally that there are some developers, some software engineers that produce 10 times more than their peers. They are that effective, right? And so that really stuck with me, and it didn't just stick with me. It's become part of the ethos of Silicon Valley and startups that, and you guys may have heard of this term, even if you're not in engineering, but the 10x developer became this unicorn that everyone was chasing after. But it's real. It's a real phenomenon. There really are developers who are so much more effective than their peers. And so I wanted to ask, can we translate the 10x concept to sales? I mean, think about it. If you're on LinkedIn, the wrong places on LinkedIn or the right places on LinkedIn, depending on where you hang out, like there's lots of people saying we can have these massive increases in productivity. And so maybe this is possible. But first, I got to kind of look at the elephant in the room here. Like Guy just showed a slide. This is a slide with a copy of Guy's slide. So he showed a slide where maybe we do already have the 10x sales rep, right? But I think the key in Paul Graham's essay is that there are certain developers who globally, across the entire universe of developers, are 10x more impactful, right? And so it's not just kind of the very top group versus the bottom group, it's the people who do radically better than the average. So I want to reframe the question a little bit around the classic mid-market SaaS AE. So SaaS AE classic here, right? So mid-market, 50K ACV, $1 million quota, like pretty vanilla, pretty standard here, right? So can we turn this classic SaaS AE into somebody who carries a $10 million quota? That's the question that I want to aim for here. And so going back to those discussions on LinkedIn and how everybody says you can have all of this incredible productivity and performance, it kind of looks a lot like this. We're just going to sprinkle AI on it. We're just going to have AI. And somehow, we don't know how exactly, we're going to get radically more productive. And so that doesn't really sit well with me because, yes, I like to write software. I have an engineering mindset. And so I want to take this from a different standpoint. So let's think about this from not sales for a second, but from other kind of engineering efforts. Let's think about human performance. Let's think about how fast people can run. I know there was a run this morning. I didn't go, but I hope some of you did, right? The average that many of you may have run is a 10-minute mile, right? That's the average human performance for running. The fastest mile ever recorded was 3 minutes and, 43 seconds, right? That's a lot faster than I can go. Probably, I'm willing to bet, faster than any of you in this room can go. And that's crazy fast, but it's not 10x. It's 2.7x, right? So what do? Well, we have to engineer a solution to that. Well, it's actually really, really simple if you want to 10x. You get a car, right? So all of us get in cars all the time, and we go 10 times the average human speed, right, when they're running. Now, if you want to have a little bit of fun here, you can strap yourself to a Saturn V, and you can go about 4,000 times as fast as the average runner, all right? But that's rocket science, and we don't actually even need to do rocket science. We just need to focus on driving a car. That's what we have to do. What is the equivalent of the car? And unfortunately, that's what this looks like right now for most of our reps, right? We take the processes we've always had, we take the data we've always had, as like our horseless carriage here, right? We sit the rep on it, and we put some AI in the trunk, and then hopefully we're going to get an outcome, right? And that's really not going to cut it for this. And so what we really want to ask is an engineering question. If you're trying to solve for something that's never been solved for, break it down. Ask what has to be true for this to be possible. So the rest of this talk, by and large, is going to be looking at what has to be true for the 10x rep to exist. And so I originally wrote about this on my newsletter, Uncharted Territory, and I posted about it on LinkedIn, and it blew up. 350,000 impressions, and a whole bunch of people telling me that I was stupid, and a whole bunch of people telling me that I was brilliant, and the usual LinkedIn sort of thing. But when I wrote all this, I broke it down into 3 major scenarios. So if we're going to 10x our reps' performance, take them from a 1 million quota to a 10 million quota, I think there's 3 paths to get there. Number 1, we just do 10 times more. We run faster, right? Number 2, we charge way more money. Pretty classic way to get somebody from 1 million to 10 million, right? Number 3 is we find ways to be radically more efficient. Now, the next thing I'm going to ask you in just a second is to go download a spreadsheet, and this will be the fun part for the afternoon where we all get to pour over numbers. But before we do that, what we have to do to solve this problem is we need to model this out. We need to think about what actually has to go into this. Because remember, I don't want to just sprinkle AI on it. I want to ask the question, what has to be true? And so I want everybody to recognize we're going to look at this model, and I love this quote from George Box. He also has a very adorable headshot. I don't really know what he's doing there. But all models are wrong, but some models are useful, and I hope that this is a useful model. So with that in mind, I'd like everybody, really quickly, yes, this is required. Oh, hey, look, everybody's actually doing it. I wasn't sure if you would. Go get the spreadsheet, okay? And there's an Excel version, there's a Google Sheets version. I'm going to refer back to it because it turns out when you try to copy and paste a giant spreadsheet onto slides, it doesn't work that well, all right? So assuming some of you got that, let's dig in and look at those 3 scenarios. So if we're going to look at these 3 scenarios, this is the top part of the spreadsheet. We're looking at each individual scenario, and we're doing simple reverse pipeline math, right? The same thing that all of us do when we try to figure out how big should a territory be, what kind of quota should we have, all of those types of things. We work backwards. We say, well, we want to achieve some kind of outcome. What's our ACV? What's our win rate? That tells us how many opportunities we need. We have something that I'm collecting here called the opportunity creation rate. That tells us how many accounts we need to actually work to produce an opportunity. And so you can work backward to how many accounts you need. Now, our $1 million baseline rep has a pretty hard job, but we do know it's doable. But the others is where it gets interesting. So if you look at the major changes across each one of these scenarios, scenario number 1 says we're going to do a lot more volume. That means we need a lot more accounts. I'll get into that in a second. Scenario number 2 says we're going to at least double ACV. I'll talk about why I don't think we can just 10x ACV in a second. And scenario number 3 says, we're going to radically improve win rates. We're going to radically improve opportunity creation rates. So let's dig into the volume scenario. So if you actually look at the flow down in that spreadsheet, or don't, either one, if you're thinking about it, what goes into this is to say, look, we know we need to engage accounts at a certain level. So it's the same thing you would do with any of your BDRs. How many touches do we expect them to have? Over what time period? With how many contacts, right? And if you take some kind of basic math around that, 15 touches, 3 contacts, that sort of thing, in the volume scenario, suddenly you're dealing with 1,800 touches per day. Now, I don't know about your BDRs, but that's a tall order, right? That starts to look a little nuts. Now, you're also dealing with 12 meetings per day to actually run the deals that you would produce in this case. But let's dig into that just a little bit further and say, what would have to happen to get to 1,800 touches per day, right? And I think this is where the first of the AI technologies comes in. We need an AI SDR who can do this type of work. And so what do you also need for this AI SDR? Well, you need a whole bunch of accounts that are high fit, high intent, right? You need good data for relevant messaging. You want to make sure that the AI knows what to say. And then lastly, they need to be able to, the AI, needs the ability to reach out to the right kind of contacts. You got to have the contact data across the channels that are effective for outbound today. And this is where I think this kind of starts to fall apart, because there's some really major problems with just ramping up volume. Number one is most of the things that we think of as AI SDRs today, they send email, right? And there's reasons they send email, which I'll touch on in a second. But email has absolutely trash reply rates, right? Email is like any of your inboxes are war zones right now. It's terrible, right? And so if you start thinking about anything that would rely heavily on email to do this, and if you're not getting 10% reply rates, which Lord knows you're not going to get that, if you're getting 1%, 0.1%, you're starting to talk about needing not just 10,000 accounts, but 100,000 accounts or 1 million accounts to reach out to do this kind of volume. And many of us don't even have a TAM that's that large. So that's one knock. The second knock is, look, we want them to be able to use the phone. Guess what? They can't. There are ways that you might be able to get around it. There are ways that you might just want to ignore, but it is literally illegal for you to make robocalls, and AI is a robocall. So the FTC has said, okay, we can't do that, right? So that channel, which I know there's folks from Nooks here, they'll tell you that's a really good channel to be able to make calls, right? You can't use that. And lastly, everybody's favorite channel, LinkedIn, right? LinkedIn hates automation, hates it with a passion, right? They kick companies off like Apollo for scraping things. They'll terminate your account if you automate too much, yet somehow they don't get all the comments, I guess. But bottom line here is you can't just expect an AI SDR to be able to do all of these things. And so for me, that's a huge knock on this type of pipeline, top of funnel activity. So we'll just put that aside for a second and talk about actually running meetings. This rep would need to run 12 meetings a day, right? Maybe doable at the outside edge, right? But most likely, in order for them to do anything else in their job, they're probably going to need to introduce a second piece of AI technology, an AI avatar, someone who's actually going to show up on the call and do the call. There's some interesting companies that are doing this type of thing right now. But the challenge is that this is going to take some getting used to, right? There are lots and lots of transactions that may be in the future, like everybody's going to be fine jumping on a call with an AI avatar. But I think there's an element of cultural change that's going to have to happen before people, again, this mid-market sales rep, before people are really okay with that, right? So when we kind of move through this and we look at the volume play and reverse engineering this, we've introduced the AI SDR, the AI avatar, as a couple of ways in which you might do this. But ultimately, we've got legal issues. You can't make phone calls. We've got technical issues. LinkedIn will kick you off, right? Email sucks. And we've got cultural issues. We need to figure out a different way for people to engage with sales reps. So to me, this doesn't look like the likely way that we get there. So that takes us to the second play, which is ACV. So ACV is the classic way that you 10x somebody's output, right? Take somebody who's selling a $100,000 deal and give them $1 million deal, right? But we framed the question around this idea of this classic SaaS sales rep. And so I would argue that if you suddenly are selling a $1 million deal, you're not really a mid-market SaaS rep anymore, right? So the things that a SaaS rep could potentially control in the sales cycle is not like an entirely different ICP and is not an entirely different product, but what they could probably do is generate better, higher quality deals, and they could probably get a 2x or 3x increase in ACV. And so let's model it out as a 2x increase, but we're kind of capped on how far we can go there. Of course, if we increase the ACV 2x, we reduce the number of opportunities we need to manage by half, which is awesome. Okay, great. That also flows through to accounts, so we're only working about half the accounts, but we're still doing 900 touches a day. And oh, by the way, that 12 meetings per day number is still 12. Why is that? Well, if you're selling higher ACV deals, you're probably going to have a few more meetings. When you kind of model out what the load is, it doesn't really go down that much. And so if we think about the big difference between this and the previous scenario is we've now got more high-stakes meetings. We've got meetings with executives that we didn't have to have before necessarily, maybe when we were selling at a slightly lower ACV. Some of those could be an AI avatar, but now we want to introduce another concept, a co-pilot, if you will. And there's a lot of companies out there talking about co-pilots, but I have a specific definition of a co-pilot that I'm going with here, which is basically an AI that works alongside the rep to ensure they have all the context about the deal that they need, ensure they have market knowledge, product knowledge, helps them with pre-call prep, helps answer questions during the call, and helps with post-call follow-up, right? That's the AI co-pilot. And so that gives them the ability to run many more meetings. And so you might be able to get away with a mix of some early discovery done with an AI avatar and then some later meetings that happen using a co-pilot. But ultimately, the ACV play, because you can't just 10x ACV, suffers from many of the same problems as the volume play. So I'm going to argue that this one is pretty unlikely. So that leaves us with the efficiency play. Now, there's two big things you're probably going to notice here. And the biggest one here is that crazy-ass win rate, right? So when I had this discussion on LinkedIn about this, this is where we got the most pushback. This was the most interesting part of the conversation. So I'll touch on that in a second. But if you look, let's hold that steady for a second. If you actually look at the metrics for the daily effort that you've got to put in, okay, crazy-ish, but maybe there's a path. And to me, I think we're really talking now from going from the impossible to the just simply very, very hard. And so let's think about this for a second. So first of all, if we're going to do 360 activities per day, we're going to need all of those accounts that we're going to work served up on a silver platter. This is probably the place where AI does the most and adds the most value today, and I'll add a little bit more about that later, but AI can do a ton of work to qualify deals, to make sure that you have the data that you need and to serve up ready-to-work accounts. So you can take some of the time off from that. And then I would argue that in this case, you don't necessarily have an AI SDR that's doing everything, but you have a human-in-the-loop kind of AI orchestration. A lot of the low-level emails and things that happen can be a human or AI. But then a human is brought in when it's the right time for them to reach out on the channels that only they can reach out on. And this isn't all that different, really, from Outreach, SalesLoft, any kind of sequencing tool that you have today. That's basically how they function. And then lastly, these meetings, you're only going to have about 6 to 7 meetings per day, which is a heavy meeting load, potentially. But again, with this idea of a co-pilot who's helping you with pre-call prep and context, that 30-minute, 45-minute call might actually only take you 35 minutes or 45 minutes instead of a half an hour of prep and then a half an hour of follow-up, and you start to get to a place where you actually could hold this many meetings each day. So let's address the 50% win rate, the elephant in the room, right? Is it just too high to be viable? And this is the kind of comment that I got. So I don't know how many of you all know Pete, but he runs a company that has a lot of data around sales process and that sort of thing. And so he scoffed at the 50% win rate on 50K deals and said that 75%, or that a 20% win rate is about a 75th percentile win rate. And that tracks fairly well with what we just heard from Guy on the EBSTA side and that work. So, 19% win rate across the board. It also tracks with Bridge Group's, I guess, every 2-year survey that they do of AEs looking at win rates. They have a 16% win rate for over 50K ACV. So this is a big assumption. This is kind of a crazy assumption. We're going to 2x or 2.5x the prevailing win rates. So the question is, can we go from ludicrous on these win rates to maybe? And I think there's two really underappreciated aspects where maybe we could make this possible. Number one, and I know this is not true for any of your reps, but many reps work bad accounts. They have bad ICP definitions, which again, none of yours, but bad ICP definitions, bad data on the accounts, bad signals, bad territories. They spend a tremendous amount of time barking up the wrong tree at the wrong time. So if we could fix that, we could have an impact here. And then, again, this is something that doesn't apply to any of your reps because they're all incredibly well-prepared and conscientious people. But how many times have you ever seen a deal go sideways because a rep kind of didn't keep track of everything they needed to keep track of. They didn't have full context, and they weren't managing the deal. They left out some stakeholders who should have been involved, all of those types of things. If you can equip those reps with a much higher capability, you can get to sort of a deal omniscience where they don't make as many of those types of mistakes. And those things all contribute to improving that win rate. But because I love math so much, I figured I would kind of model out the impact of not necessarily that deal omniscience piece, but the effect of having better accounts. So what you're seeing in this flow chart here is, let's say we start with 1,000 accounts, right? Well, what happens in the model that we described at the beginning for that, vanilla classic SaaS rep? Well, the reality is they don't always get to every account, right? So some of them end up unengaged. They follow the model that we modeled out perfectly, right? So they get a 10% opportunity creation rate and then a 20% win rate. So at the end of all of this, when you work through that math, they've closed 18 deals. They didn't get quite to their, $1 million quota at a 50K ACV, but they did pretty well. Now, let's double click into that for a second. And let's look at what's really going on under the hood for those exact same numbers. I think we all know that territories, all the accounts in a territory are not all created equal. We've done our reverse pipeline math. We've created a territory with, or a book of business with 1,000 accounts in it. Some of those are really good. Some of those are marginal at best. So let's say half of those are really good. Half of them are marginal. Well, what happens? Well, under the hood, we have about a 5% opportunity creation rate on the ones that are marginal. On the ones that are good, maybe it's 15%, right? By the way, this all comes out in the wash as a 10% opportunity creation rate. And then if you play that forward, the ones that we're creating more opportunities with because they're good, we're also winning more with. Our win rate's more like 25%, maybe it's 30%. And for those that are not so good, maybe we're winning more like 5, 6, 7, 8%, right? Again, if you put all these numbers together, they look the same as that other model. So what happens? Only 2 of the wins come from the marginal accounts. 16 of the wins come from the good accounts. So the ability here to give reps better accounts has an outsized impact on that win rate. And so we don't necessarily have to just sit back and say, no, it's not possible to have a massively higher win rate. We need to think about the things that we could change to make that possible. And that's where this surprised me, because when I first set out to do this analysis, I didn't expect this. I thought that none of this was actually going to work, but it turns out there's not massive legal, cultural, technical things that you have to change to make the efficiency play work. So I'm going to give that a verdict of possible. This is the most likely path towards the 10x sales rep. And I actually believe the 10x sales rep is potentially viable. So what does this mean for us in the room? So I want to touch on what does this mean and what do we do about it? So first of all, what does it mean? Well, this is what we all want it to mean, okay? Our ARR per FTE is going to skyrocket. Our CAC is going to go way down. We're happy. Our VCs are happy. Our board's happy. Our CEO's happy. It's beautiful, right? So I'll tell you this. Like, if a 10x sales rep exists, and I can have 10 sales reps where I used to have 100 sales reps, then hell yeah, my ARR per FTE is going to go up, right? The other thing, as far as CAC, brings me back to that Paul Graham essay for a second. So he was talking about developers, but he was talking in a startup context, and he was talking to VCs as well. And one of the things he said was, these 10x engineers, they just really want great problems. They want hard problems to work on. And the great part is that you give them a hard problem, they'll give you 10x the output, and you can only pay them 2 or 3x everything else, right? And I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like sales reps to me, all right? So if you think about a prevailing like 5-to-1 quota to OTE ratio, if a sales rep is going to be this massively effective, guess what? You're not going to pay them what you're paying them today. You're going to pay them a 7-figure W-2, right? So that's the thing to think about here is the actual cost doesn't really go down. Now, in the future, if this is common, if we can raise quotas massively, then yes, maybe some of that pricing power erodes. But right now, I wouldn't expect a CAC bonanza. So this isn't going to happen. So what do you do today, right? I'm trying to make this less of a completely conceptual talk and talk about where we can actually spend time. And I think there's 3 areas where we can make some investments today that are going to pay off as we find our way into this future. Number 1, external data. It has never been easier to get information that you can use to target accounts and figure out your timing with accounts from the internet at large. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Number 2, all of your systems today are garbage, most likely, right? Everything you've got in terms of the data that you have in your CRM, the exposure of particular capabilities to the CRM, all of those things have to be made available. If I'm going to have an AI SDR, an AI avatar, or an AI copilot, they've got to be able to access my systems. And there's a whole other talk about the complexity of that, the bad data, the security issues, all of those kinds of things. But I will tell you this, if you want to enable any of these like agentic behaviors or anything, you need to go hug your CISO. You need to get very close with your IT folks because you're going to have a lot of conversations over the next couple of years. And lastly, we heard a lot about agility earlier. We got to be more agile. We have to change our processes. So I want to drill just a little bit further into 2 areas here. Number 1, this whole idea of AI data that's coming from external sources as well as internal sources. So this is hugely important. I cannot stress enough how much opportunity there is to go learn things that you couldn't learn before. If your idea of data for your sales team is going and buying Zoom info and getting basic firmographics and some contact info, you are going to be woefully left behind because we have this ability now to go out to the wider web, search data, synthesize data, collect signals, classify accounts before they even hit the sales rep. We heard a lot about lead scoring and things like that earlier. All of this is available to you, and there's a ton of tools that make that available. Clay's right outside. I'm on stage. Like, there are lots of ways that you can make these things happen. So you need to be experimenting with this. You need to be figuring out how you can go find these data points that will enable you to sell in a way that's more compelling besides just standard firmographics. And finally, the processes we have in place today. If you think about the cadence of the sales year, right? What do we do? Once a year. It's going to start in a few months, depending on how big your company is. We do this annual planning exercise. And I'm not sure who shared it earlier, but they talked about the idea of like replanning multiple times per year, right? Like we're having to do that because this annual planning process where we do once a year segmentation, once a year territory carves, those types of things, that doesn't work. That doesn't operate at the speed of AI, and it doesn't operate at the way that you need to operate to make sure that you're actually taking advantage of any opportunities that are out there. So you have to move to much more dynamic processes. You have to be thinking about continuously evaluating, am I going after the right accounts? Are those accounts in the hands of the right reps? And augmenting that with AI and finding these opportunities to incorporate AI to help you qualify and prioritize accounts and AI to help the reps work those accounts. But just because you think something is right on November 30th of 2025, that's not going to tell you anything about the sale you actually need to make in July of 2026, right? So as you're going into your annual planning, push on adaptability, push on the idea that you can't just set these things in stone. So how do you make sure that you're not just replanning and replanning and replanning, but actually building something that can be consistently updated throughout the year? And that's going to be a fundamentally difficult challenge for everybody. So after doing this analysis, I've come to the conclusion that 10x reps are possible. They're not going to happen tomorrow, but we are going to see a phenomenal increase, especially through this efficiency play, of rep performance, right? Beyond what we thought was possible. And so I'll leave you with this major question. 10x reps are possible. So will they be your reps, right? What are you going to do after this to try to make this possible for your team and enable this there? So with that, thank you all very much. Really appreciate the time.